few years ago, Jay Leno on The Tonight Show went out of the studio and onto the street to quiz people. He quizzed them about their knowledge of the Bible. He went up to one person and asked, "Name these two brothers, Cain and..." All he got was a blank stare. Apparently, that person had never heard of Cain and Abel. To another person, Jay Leno asked, "What happened to Lot's wife?" "Who is Lot?" the person asked. So Jay Leno tried to give the person a kind of hint. He said, "Well, Lot's wife turned into an angel?" the person asked. Obviously, the person was not familiar with the story in the Bible about how Lot's wife had been turned into a pillar of salt. Or one more person Jay Leno went up to, he asked, "Can you name one of the apostles?" No response. So he asked, "Can you name the 4 Beatles?" And right away, the person rattled off the names of John, Paul, George, and Ringo. It's no big secret today that most Americans don't know what's in the Bible. Yes, most American families own a Bible. In fact, most American households own multiple Bibles. But while the Bible holds the distinction of being the best-selling book of all time, my guess is that the Bible also holds the dubious honor of being one of the least read books of all time. On one level, that means that most Americans today don't know the information that's in the Bible. They don't know the names, the places, the events. Names like Elijah or Ezekiel or Mary Magdalene don't mean anything to many people today. Even stories like Noah and the Ark, or Joshua and the Battle of Jericho, or the raising of Lazarus from the grave are stories that many people today are not familiar with. And that's a real problem. But on another deeper level, our lack of familiarity with the Bible also means that many people today are not aware of the vision that God has for us. Not only do most people today not know the history that's in the Bible, the stories of what God has done in the past in people's lives. At the same time, many people today are also not aware of the future that God has in mind for us. The ways that God wants to be at work in our lives right here, now, today. And without that kind of vision, all too often what people end up doing is looking at the world around them with all the violence and evil and sadness that's there, and they end up figuring, well, that's just the way that life is. And that's the way it's always going to be. Many of you are likely familiar with the author James Fenimore Cooper. He's probably best known for his novel, The Last of the Mohicans. But one other book that he wrote was called The Pioneers. In that story, a young man headed out west in the 1800s to build a great city on the frontier. And as the months went by, he wrote to his cousin back east and told her about this marvelous city that he was constructing, with all its tall buildings, its spacious parks, and wide paved streets. Well, finally, the cousin decided to go out west and see this city. But when she arrived, she looked around, and all she could see were woods and So she asked her cousin, "Where is this dazzling city you told me about? Where is this thriving metropolis?" He said, "Where? Why, everywhere." Even though that city had not yet been built, in his mind, he could see as clear as day what that city was one day going to look like. In other words, he had the ability to look beyond the way that things were at the moment and to see things as how one day they would be. And really, that is what this part of the Bible that we listen to today from the prophet Isaiah is trying to do for us. You see, this part of Isaiah was written during an especially dark period in Israel's history. This part of Isaiah was written at a time when Isaiah and many of his fellow Jews had been taken away to live in exile in the land of Babylon. You see, some years before, the Babylonian army had invaded the land of Israel, had conquered them, had burned down their temple, and then had carried away many of them to presumably live out the rest of their days as exiles, as prisoners in the land of Babylon. But in the midst of all that darkness, all that sadness, all that despair, one day Isaiah came along with a word from God. And that word from God was that despite what the people of that day might be thinking, God was about to do a new thing in their midst. God was going to bring about a new thing in their lives by enabling them to return to their homeland and to fulfill the mission that God had for them. And what was that mission? Well, time and time again in this passage, God says that their mission is to bring forth justice into the world. Now, nowadays, when we hear the word justice, we tend to conjure up images of police officers and jails and rounding up the bad guys. But as it's used in the Old Testament, the Hebrew word mishpat, which usually gets translated as justice, means much more than that. Most basically, to bring forth justice means to be at work in our society and in our world to make things more and more the way that God wants them to be. But again, we need to realize that God was speaking of this grand vision to a bunch of exiles, a bunch of prisoners of war. Who are we, they probably asked themselves, to go out and be God's instruments for changing the world? But God assured them, and God assures us, that as God pours out God's Spirit into our lives, there's no limit to what's possible. After all, as God poured out the Spirit into the life of Moses, Moses was empowered to do the impossible by freeing the Hebrew slaves from Egypt and leading them out and on to a new special land that God was going to give them. As God poured out the Spirit into the life of the shepherd boy David, David was empowered to do the impossible by freeing his people from the fear and terror that they had of the Philistine army, by slaying the giant named Goliath. And as God poured out the Spirit into the life of Jesus, Jesus was empowered